Sociology Robot. Hello and welcome to the 7th video lecture on OCR A Level Sociology, Paper 1, looking at consumer culture and global culture. But before we can get into them, we need to look at one other type of culture that isn't in the specification, but it's quite important that you understand it. And this is the idea of folk culture. Now, by folk culture, we mean the culture that's created by the people who consume it, for the people who consume it. An authentic way of living, which people do for themselves without needing to have any entertainment provided for them by anyone else. An example might be local folk music. People pick up their own instruments, they get together, they play the tunes that they know, maybe they come up with their own lyrics about things in their community and their history. There are also folk cultural recipes. Think of haggis in Scotland. It's part of Scottish folk culture. It's a very easy dish to make using local ingredients. There are folk cultural ways of dressing. I'm going to give the example of kilts in Scotland. And of course, very important in the United Kingdom, there are folk cultural dialects and accents, ways of speaking that immediately mark you out as where you're from, and people take a pride in their accent and their dialect. Now, with that in mind, we can look at consumer culture. Consumer culture means cultural products that are bought in shops and promoted through advertising. So we could use the example of pop music, chart music. You don't make it yourself, you just listen to it. It's not about your life and your community. It's about, Ariana Grande's life and her community. Usually rather wealthy and corporate creators. Supermarkets are an important aspect of consumer culture with their brands and the fashions that they establish. And of course, speaking of brands and fashion, there are fashion brands. These things carry a lot of status. A more recent form of consumer culture are subscriber-only channels for sports or for entertainment. You pay a regular amount of money to have access to these, and again, it's entertainment produced by large corporations. It's not about you. You haven't come up with these stories. They're provided for you by someone else. This leads to a related concept of consumerism. Consumerism being a lifestyle of shopping, surfing the internet, wearing the latest fashions. What can we say in favour of consumer culture? Well, it's inclusive. It's available to anyone who can pay for it. And a lot of consumer culture is quite cheap. Think about junk food, for example. There is also an exclusive aspect to consumer culture, like high-end luxury goods. So this makes a link between consumer culture and both high culture and popular culture that we looked at in the last video. And in the same way, consumer culture can be privileged if you are on trend, the latest fashions, the latest products, the latest version of a mobile phone. And it can be stigmatized if it's cheap or off-brand or out of date or unfashionable. Let's look now at global culture. This is a culture that is shared all over the world. An obvious example would be American pop music and Hollywood films and media empires like Disney. People are familiar with Disney products in every continent. Global culture includes world foods that you can find everywhere. Burgers, noodles, pizza. There are global sports stars, global celebrities, global teams that have their supporters in every country. And worldwide brands like Nike, Apple, and Coca-Cola. So obviously global culture is linked to consumer culture. It's a sort of worldwide version of consumer culture. But high culture is global too. There are things like horse racing, yachting, attending art galleries, going to the opera, that draw together the global elite from every country. Global culture has been explained by colonialism, the history of European and American culture being spread around the world by force. According to this view, global culture then has a legacy of exploitation and unfairness. However, global culture doesn't all go in one direction. There is reverse colonialism. This is where non-European cultures that were sometimes the victims of colonialism, have also contributed to global culture. This is culture flowing the other way. You could give the example of Chinese food, which is now popular all over the world, Japanese animated movies, and South Korean television programs. Global culture has led to a debate about homogeneity. Homogeneity means sameness, and there are people who are concerned that global culture is going to lead to the emergence of this bland worldwide culture with no variety, where everybody dresses the same and eats the same food, watches the same shows, listens to the same music. Other people point out, though, that such a global culture might be safer and wealthier, and there would be less room for conflict and misunderstanding because we would share so much in common. What key scholars look at global and consumer culture? Jean Baudrillard is a 20th century French philosopher. He's part of a sociological movement known as postmodernism, and we haven't looked at postmodernism yet. It will feature more when we get onto section B of paper 1. Baudrillard wrote many books, but we're going to look here at The Consumer Society from 1970. Baudrillard makes the case that people acquire their identity from being consumers. In effect, you are what you buy. He believes that as a society we're now overdosed with media. He calls this media saturation. You can't escape from television, movies, radio, and now, of course, the internet. He believes that we're now living our life through media images. His term for this is hyperreality, and he claims that we no longer have access to the real world. We live entirely in a world of hyperreality. This raises a big question about consumer culture, which is authenticity. Consumer culture is inauthentic because people are not producing it for themselves. It's been handed over to them. Marxists claim that this will lead to alienation, deep unhappiness, and functionalists will predict that it will lead to anomie, and therefore potentially crime, drug addiction, suicide. Baudrillard isn't so certain. He thinks that even our anomie these days is inauthentic too. We can't escape from hyperreality. For better or worse, we're now trapped in the world of media images. Another 20th century philosopher who thought about these matters is Anthony Giddens, a British interactionist, and we'll look at interactionism later in this section of the exam. Giddens' great work is 1999's Runaway World, and I must say, if as a student of sociology you are going to read one sociological book during your A-level, then it should be this one. It is quite short, it's incredibly clear and easy to read, and it's just bursting with interesting ideas. Giddens argues that we are developing a global outlook as the media brings news stories to our doorstep and makes events in other parts of the world impossible for us to escape from. This leads to what he calls cosmopolitanism, a culture that sees itself as not belonging to any particular place or any particular country. Linked to this is detraditionalization. This is when people start to question the traditional beliefs and lifestyles they were brought up with and that their parents or grandparents perhaps took for granted. Giddens is aware that not everybody likes this loss of tradition. There's a thing called cultural defense, which is when people resist global culture by intensifying their traditional beliefs. For example, religious fundamentalism is an attempt to keep the global culture at bay. And extreme nationalism has a similar dissatisfaction with global culture. How can we evaluate these types of culture? Consumer culture is criticised by functionalists because it involves abandoning traditions. Functionalists are great believers in the importance of tradition, and folk culture is the true traditional culture. Functionalists do believe in the march of progress, and they would say that consumer culture might simply function better than folk culture does, and that's why it is so successful. Functionalists will have a concern about disconnecting ourselves from tradition, and that this might lead to anomie, a state of deep unhappiness and social dysfunction. Marxists similarly criticize consumer culture because it abandons the working class roots of society, and that again is folk culture. But Marxists would go further with their criticism. They would say that consumer culture is a product of capitalism, and therefore it has to create alienation. We've already seen the arguments of British Marxist Jock Young, who claims that consumer culture has produced a bulimic society, where we are constantly hungry for the latest products, but the moment we've got them, we're not satisfied anymore and we want the next thing. Young links this to crime because of the deep dissatisfaction and envy it produces in people. Feminists find a lot to criticize in consumer culture because the female body is used to advertise products, and this contributes to the treatment of women as sex objects. Porn is a huge part of consumer culture as well, and many feminists see that as harmful towards women. Global culture is criticized by functionalists because they have great attachment to national identity. However, functionalists also believe in the march of progress and would see much global culture as a result of the success of European and American culture, which is spreading around the world because it functions better. What's less clear is whether global culture can create the sort of social solidarity that functionalists think we need. Is global culture perhaps too inauthentic to provide what we need to flourish? Many Marxists have got even less time for global culture, seeing it as how it spreads capitalist ideology. In fact, some would go so far as to call it cultural imperialism. It's another way for Europe and America to dominate the world. However, some Marxists point out that global culture enables other societies to resist European and American capitalism and push back with their own ideas. The concern among feminists is that global culture will lead to the spread of a patriarchal ideology. But this leads to arguments that are very difficult to resolve. For what are we to make of cultures that resist global culture, but have their own patriarchal gender roles? Whose side should feminists be on? Should we be spreading a global culture of women's rights, or respecting local cultures that perhaps view women in a very different light? This cartoon gives a good insight into how difficult it is to settle that argument. Let's summarize what we know. Consumer culture is available to everyone for a price. It is superficial, and it's replacing folk culture. Global culture is also taking over the world, and many people see it as just an extension of European and American culture, a form of cultural imperialism. It triggers in some areas cultural defense when people resist it and they intensify their own cultural traditions. But it also allows for reverse colonialism when cultures are able to influence European and American culture in return. We've looked at the work of Baudrillard, 1970, who argues we're defined by consumer culture. We live in a media-saturated society. And, in fact, we're trapped in a world of hyper-reality, unable to determine what's real because we're so enslaved to media images. Giddens argues that global culture has led to a global outlook. He terms this cosmopolitanism, and believes it is brought about by de-traditionalization, which is the end of folk culture. However, Giddens admits that the passing of folk culture and tradition produces strong reactions like religious fundamentalism. What sort of exam questions could come up on this topic? Question 1, as usual, will ask you to explain one of these two concepts using examples for 6 marks. Question 2 will give you 2 sources, a picture and a short passage to read. And then we'll ask you a 12-mark question. Using sources A and B and your wider sociological knowledge, explain the concept of, and in this case, consumer culture. You might answer this question by saying what you can see in the picture. You've got a stylishly dressed woman. She is carrying shopping from quite expensive stores, and her wealth and privilege is contrasted with the beggar sitting in the street as she walks past. This tells us something about some of the inequalities in consumer culture. Source B argues that people are turning their back on consumer culture and looking for folk culture instead, because they want a more authentic experience. You will need to quote from source B and then say what those quotes tell us about the good or bad points of consumer culture. Question number 3 is the essay, a 20-mark question. Here are 2 examples. Outline and briefly evaluate the view that global culture is becoming more important. A question like this would look for you to make, say, 3 points. You might argue that global culture is spreading. You might use Anthony Giddens' arguments for cosmopolitanism and detraditionalization as evidence for this. And you could give some examples of worldwide brands and world-famous celebrities. You should then do a brief evaluation, and you might point out that some groups fiercely resist this sort of global culture. You might make another point that global culture is linked to consumer culture. Big corporations like Amazon and Netflix, and how they reach billions of people worldwide. You could bring in Baudrillard's idea of hyperreality. But you can evaluate this by pointing out that many people still live lives rather untouched by these corporations and still continue with their own folk culture. You could finish off by making an argument that global culture is replacing national identity. You could evaluate this by talking about the fears the functionalists have that this might lead to anomie. A second question here asks you to outline and briefly evaluate the view that consumer culture is harmful. And here you might give an argument that it spreads ruling class ideology and leads to a bulimic society, and another argument that it objectifies women and spreads patriarchal values. But you might finish off with an argument that consumer culture offers entertainment, distraction, and education for people at a price that they can afford. I hope that's been helpful. You can find more about culture and sociology in my study guide, Socialisation, Culture and Identity, or the combined study guide with the Youth Subcultures option. Both of those are available from Amazon, and there are links in the description. Sociology Robot.